Welcome to the haunting of Northwest Michigan. This evening's excursion into our local ghost stories is brought to you by Oak Heirlooms on Boone Road in Cadillac. Visiting with Susan from Oak Heirlooms in Cadillac, we all know the cost of living is high, but Oak Heirlooms is working hard to keep life's nicer things within reach.
We want to be good to the people who have supported us for the last 35 years. I cannot begin to say how grateful I am for everyone.
Well, how about we offer a special discount to our radio listeners?
I really like that idea. When you stop in, ask us about the radio listener discount.
Oak Heirlooms on Boone Road in Cadillac, serving you for 35 years. Close your eyes and imagine you are standing in a large room. On the far wall, there are 5 blank doors. There are no labels or windows to offer clues to you as to what is behind these doors. You just have to open one to see for yourself. So go ahead, choose a door, and let's go storytelling. As holidays go, the opening day of firearm deer season in Michigan is like no other. It was more than a holiday, really. It was a rite of passage for young hunters. And this was to be Dylan's first opening day on his own. For his 21st birthday, he was given a gun that had once been owned by his grandfather, a gorgeous .30-06. Leading up to opening day, Dylan had tried sighting in the rifle, but something was off. He was normally a really good shot, but even from a modest distance, he couldn't seem to hit anything. He knew that if he came home empty-handed on opening day, he would never hear the end of it. So the night before opening day, Dylan was sitting on a bar stool at the Buck's Inn, working up his excuses to not be in his blind the next morning. A man at the end of the bar snared his attention. "Ready for tomorrow?" the stranger asked. Dylan faked a cough and said he didn't really think he'd be able to go out. He had this cold. "Ah, you're not sick, you're afraid," the man said. Dylan turned to see the stranger staring back at him with a smirk. "What if I told you I'll guarantee you'll come home with the biggest buck you've ever seen? And what if I told you you'll bring home a buck every year for the next 5 years, each one bigger?" The stranger then placed on the bar 6 rounds, .30-06. The brass looked like gold, and the bullets were a mirror like silver. "These 6 are for you to use. The first 5 will never miss the buck you're hunting. The 6th, well, the 6th won't miss a target, but I get to choose it." Dylan's gaze moved from the rounds on the bar to the stranger and back. He didn't remember actually leaving the bar, but as he walked to his truck, he could feel the weight of those rounds in his pocket. Sitting in his blind the next morning, just as the sun was coming up and the fog lifting, Dylan held his hand on one of the rounds given to him the night before. He still didn't know who that guy was. He'd never seen him. So how could he guarantee this bullet was going to be the perfect shot? And not just this one, but the first 5. And what did he mean about the 6th shot? With these questions swirling in his mind, he heard a crack in the trees to his left, and into the clearing stepped a buck like none Dylan had ever seen. He loaded the silver-tipped round into his rifle, took aim, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. When he pulled his truck into the parking lot at the Buck Inn a couple of hours later, the crew assembled for the annual buck poll fell silent. Charlie, who owned the inn, stepped forward without taking his eyes off the trophy in the back of Dylan's truck and said, "I don't even have to string that one up. No one's going to beat that." Dylan was celebrated in a way he'd never experienced before. People who'd known him his whole life but never went out of their way to talk to him suddenly were slapping him on the back and wanted to be his friend. The next year on opening day, it happened again, even bigger than the year before. The town's attention was on him, including the attention of a particular young woman who Dylan had been hoping to impress. The two started dating, and by the time of opening day the 3rd year, Dylan celebrated his third consecutive win at the buck pole. And he also proposed to the young girl. She said yes. A date was set for opening day the following year. And shortly after Dylan brought home yet another record-setting buck, his fourth in a row, they both said, "I do." By the time Dylan captured his fifth buck pole competition the following year, he was a father and more than a local celebrity. Magazines, TV shows, YouTubers, influencers all sought him out to tell the story of his amazing hunting success. As opening day came around again, Dylan was shocked to realize he had just one round left, that sixth round. He wasn't too concerned. By now, he was regarded as the best shot in the county, heck, maybe even the state. Plus, he might be a good enough shot even without those silver-tipped rounds. So he loaded it into his gun, the sixth, and he heard leaves crunching near his blind. The sun was just coming up. He saw a buck come into the clearing. He lifted his rifle, held his breath, and squeezed the trigger. This time, however, instead of seeing another record-setting buck fall in front of his blind, the buck turned at the sound of the shot and ran off into the trees. Dylan lowered his rifle, shocked. Accustomed to needing just one shot, he didn't have any more rounds. He passed the buck pole on the way home. The crowd that would normally be there was instead gathered on the road outside his home a few blocks away. As he pulled into the driveway, he was met by several sheriff's deputies. As the ambulance pulled in, he saw her. His young wife was lying just inside the front door, her sweatshirt stained a dark red. Hours later, Dylan was describing what had happened to the deputies when the sheriff came into the interrogation room and dropped a plastic bag on the table. Inside the bag was a lump of metal. It was the bullet that had killed Dylan's wife. Seeing it, the blood drained from Dylan's face. The plastic bag contained one shiny silver bullet. There was no trial. Although ballistics experts could show that the silver slug recovered from the body was fired by Dylan's rifle, several people placed him miles away when his wife was killed. The world changed for Dylan after that. He never went hunting again. His son moved in with his maternal grandparents. A few years later, Dylan went into the woods on opening day, past his old blind through the clearing, and was never seen again. But something else started happening on opening day. Hunters, sitting in their blinds or tree stands, would find themselves raising their rifles, taking aim at a large buck, and just as they were about to squeeze the trigger, the buck would be spooked by a sudden wailing sound nearby, and it would run off into the woods. No one was ever able to identify the source of the wailing, and it's only been heard on opening day, just as the sun comes up and the fog begins to lift. The haunting of Northwest Michigan.
Carla, a young mother of two, moved from Birmingham to northern Michigan in the early summer of 1987. She didn't know anyone here, but she hoped to get a fresh start. Carla and her twin boys were still reeling from the loss of their beloved husband and father, Richard. Richard had been an avid pilot and had been lost in a small plane crash 2 days before Christmas of 1986. By luck, Carla found just the place she had dreamed of when considering the move north. A small farmhouse set on 10 acres in northern Wexford County. It was just a mile from the school where her twin boys would start second grade in the fall. The house needed some work, but the landlord agreed to shave money off the rent if Carla would do the repairs. Keeping busy on the house proved very therapeutic. She started by painting and recarpeting the boys' room, then moved on to the 2 bathrooms. In a rare selfish moment, Carla decided to redo her bath first and to make it someplace special. She spent July and half of August laying down beautiful tile, then replaced every fixture, the cabinets, sink, and best of all, the bathtub and shower. On the day the job was finished, Carla was very excited. For the first time in months, she was looking forward to putting the boys to bed, then relaxing her weary muscles in a steaming hot bath. That night, she had just settled into that luxurious bath and placed a warm washcloth over her eyes when she heard the bathroom doorknob rattle back and forth. "Use the upstairs bathroom, please," she called out, not even stirring from her bath. She believed that one of the boys had gotten out of bed for a drink of water and wanted to use her nice new bathroom before climbing back into bed. When the doorknob did not rattle again, her suspicion was confirmed. The next morning at breakfast, she asked the boys which of them had been downstairs the night before. They looked at each other and back at her, and in unison they said, "Not me." After the boys went out to play, Carla went to work tearing apart their bathroom and worked on it all day. By the time the dinner dishes were done and the boys had gotten ready for bed, she was exhausted. She decided that tonight, instead of a long hot bath, she'd choose a quick shower. She had just lathered her hair with shampoo when the doorknob rattled again. She groaned in frustration. "You'll just have to wait a few minutes," she called out. There was no reply. A cold draft ran across her back. "Matt?" she called out. There was no answer. "Michael?" Again, no answer. She strained her ears and heard a soft click and then a squeak as the bathroom door opened. Even though she was behind textured glass, Carla spun around to hide herself. She opened her eyes and glared through the rippled surface of the shower door and into the steam-filled room. After a few seconds, shampoo ran into her eyes and she had to snap them shut. But they had been open long enough to see the wavy image of a man standing in her bathroom, looking at her. "Who are you?" she demanded nervously, pinching her eyes tightly against the pane of the shampoo. "How did you get in here?" A soft and familiar voice replied, "I just wanted to tell you something, Car. I just want you not to worry. I'm watching. Everything will be all right." Carla couldn't believe her ears. "Richard?" she gasped. She flung her head under the shower to rinse away the shampoo, then bounded out of the shower and into an empty bathroom. The door stood open. She wrapped a towel around herself and ran into the bedroom, then the living room. But there was no sign of him. While excited, Carla was not afraid. Something about his voice was always soothing, and it was unquestionably his voice. After a year of renting the farmhouse, Carla made an offer and purchased it. She raised her boys there and sent them off to college. Along the way, she met a bachelor farmer named Mitch. They married and live in the farmhouse to this day. Richard never returned, never spoke to her again, but he didn't have to, because just as he had promised, everything turned out all right. The Haunting of Northwest Michigan.
Edna Grace spent her adult years in Chicago, but as a child she grew up in the small lakeshore community of Arcadia. From the time she learned to read, Edna loved books. Because of this, her favorite place in the world was the Manistee Library. Edna would spend hour after happy hour browsing the shelves. Her library card was her most treasured possession, and she always left with an armload of reading. One stormy September day, Edna's father dropped her off at the library, and she was walking in a section of reference books when she came across a door marked Rare Collections. The glass in the door was opaque, and the room behind was dark. She tried the knob and was surprised to find it unlocked. The room smelled strong of musty leather and old paper. Dust flakes danced in the shafts of light streaming in through the old windows. The wooden shelves sagged under the weight of hundreds of large, leather-bound volumes. She browsed the titles, running a finger along the spines. Most of them didn't interest Edna until she ran across a small, tattered book entitled Spells, Curses, and Cures. She slipped it off the shelf and took it out for the better light of the main room. She sat at a table and turned each brown-edged page, producing a crackling sound. She read through sections of ancient rituals, chants, and recipes for strange potions. Then slowly, Edna began feeling a tingling growing in her feet and hands, like they had gone to sleep. She considered getting up and shaking the feeling off, but somehow she couldn't take her eyes off the book. Then her vision became tunnel-focused. The room seemed to darken and blur, all except the pages of the book, which almost seemed to glow. Edna's mind seemed to swirl as she read, absorbing this strange, ancient knowledge. A sharp clap of thunder outside snapped Edna from this trance-like state. She glanced up at the clock and was shocked to find, while it seemed she had been reading for just a few minutes, over 4 hours had passed. Something told her to leave the book on the table and walk away, but curiosity overtook her. She took the book downstairs and laid it on the desk. The librarian, an elderly lady with white hair, was talking to another patron, then turned to Edna with a smile. When she saw the book, she covered her mouth and whispered, "Oh my God." Her chair scraped across the floor as she stood up and backed away. "Young lady," she said, "where did you find that book?" Edna was confused and a little frightened by the librarian's response. It was in a room upstairs. Rare collections," it said on the door. "And just how did you get in there?" the librarian snapped. "That room is always locked." "No, it was unlocked, I swear." The librarian looked at Edna, then at the book and back again. "Do you feel all right?" she asked. What a strange question, Edna thought. "Yes, I do." "Did you read the book?" the librarian asked, crossing her arms nervously across her midsection. A little. Did you feel anything strange then?" "Oh, tingly, I guess. A little strange, maybe." "Come with me," the librarian ordered, and guided Edna back to a small office. "Sit here." Edna sat down. She felt fear begin to creep, and her throat began to tighten. "What I'm about to share with you is only known to a handful of people, all grown-ups, but you seem mature enough to hear it." Edna leaned forward. "Okay." That book was donated to the library anonymously just a few days after we opened in 2005. It was found in a brown bag on the front steps by our first librarian, Mr. Powell. He died of a stroke a week later. 4 people checked that book out in the first year. 2 of them committed suicide. 1 went mad. The 4th vanished and has never been seen again. I came here 10 years ago and heard these stories and thought it was crazy. I didn't believe it until I did some research myself. It seems everyone who reads that book, or even has limited contact with it, is cursed. "Why didn't someone get rid of it before now?" Edna said. "Oh, we've tried. We sold it to a collector in Chicago. He hung himself the day it arrived in the mail. The book came back in the same brown bag a week later. I gave the janitor instructions to bury it in the woods. He did, but the book came back again in the same brown bag. Last year, I did something unspeakable for a librarian. I actually burned that book in my fireplace. Surely not this same book, Edna gasped. I'm afraid it is. Only this time, it didn't come back in the brown bag. It just appeared on the shelf where you found it. Oh, heavens, Edna said. Am I cursed now? I don't think so, said the librarian. You seem to be stronger than whatever power it has. So that being the case, can you do something for me? Edna nodded, a bit uncertainly. I will hide this book somewhere in the library where no one can find it. If you will remain silent about it, so will I. I do not want to allow this one bad book to scare people away from all the good ones. Do you understand? Edna did understand and agreed, and for all of her life, she kept her promise and never spoke of the book again. Until tonight. The Haunting of Northwest Michigan.
On a rainy night in 1956, a local sheriff's deputy was dispatched to meet a group of teenagers waiting at a gas station along the highway. When he arrived at the scene, the group told him they had nearly hit a man who was walking alongside the road a mile or so away. The man was young, in his early 20s, and he was wearing a tuxedo. After narrowly missing the man, the teens tried to stop and talk with him, but he did not respond to them at all. The deputy drove to the spot and pulled off the highway. The rain beat hard on his windshield, so the officer pulled out a raincoat from the back. As he slipped it on, he watched the tuxedo-clad young man walk back and forth on the shoulder of the road. It was 2:15 a.m. Fearing that he was walking into some kind of trouble, the deputy radioed for another officer as backup. Then he got out of the car and walked toward the well-dressed young man, shining his flashlight toward his face. The rain came in wind-driven sheets, but strangely, the young man's hair did not even seem to be wet, nor were there any drops of water on his face. "Are you okay?" the officer shouted over the sound of the storm. The young man did not respond. He did not stop pacing. It was as though he didn't even notice the officer or hear his question. "Hey, buddy, what's the problem?" shouted the officer. Again, the young man seemed to ignore him. He seemed to be in some sort of shock. The deputy noticed that periodically the man looked toward the ditch. The deputy shined his flashlight there, but all there was to see was a thick mat of grass and bushes. Suddenly, the young man stopped and looked straight at the officer. He pointed toward the ditch. "Don't let them forget," he said. The deputy was frozen in place as a tear welled in the young man's eye and ran down his cheek. The rain was pouring in buckets, and although he wore no hat, the young man's face was completely dry, except for the path of this single tear. Forget what?" inquired the deputy, suddenly feeling a chill run down his spine. Something seemed vaguely familiar about this man. Then something else caught his attention. Over the young man's shoulder and across the highway from where they stood was a wooden billboard. even though he was shining his flashlight straight at the young man. The beam of light formed a perfect circle on the billboard. There were no shadows. The light was unbroken. At that moment, the second sheriff's department vehicle arrived. The deputy walked back to the car and met the other officer. "This is a weird one," he said, laughing nervously, then went on to explain the details of the encounter from the beginning. When he had finished, the other deputy looked at him incredulously. "So, where's this guy now, in your cruiser?" The first deputy spun on his heel and shined his flashlight to where the young man had been standing in his tuxedo just seconds before. There was no one there. The two officers walked to the spot and moved their flashlight beams around. There was no sign of the young man. The second officer brought his light to the muddy shoulder of the road. The only footprints were from police-issue boots. "What is going on?" said the first deputy. "He was right here, I swear. Where would he go?" "Did you say the guy was wearing a tux?" asked the other officer. The first deputy nodded. "Yeah, he was pointing into the ditch. All he said was, 'Don't let them forget.'" The backup officer thought for a moment. "Does this spot look familiar to you?" he asked. "About 2 years ago, there was a bad accident here. A couple of kids coming from a wedding reception. Too much to drink. The guy lost control and rolled his convertible into this ditch. Killed himself and his girlfriend." A chill shot through the first officer. He remembered now. He knew the young man had looked familiar. He walked down into the ditch, pushing aside the thick undergrowth. The rain slowed to a drizzle, then stopped. The light from his flashlight picked up the shape of a cross lying on its back, tangled in the tall grass. It was white, or once was. The small wooden cross was hand-painted with light blue trim. 2 names were painted there, James and Diana. It was dated June 8th, 1954. At the bottom it read, "May they rest in peace." The deputy took the cross home, cleaned it up, and returned the next day. Using a scythe, he cut a swath into the heavy growth and replaced the cross where it had originally stood 2 years before. To this day, the children of the deputy maintain the spot where the cross stands, along the highway. The young man in the tuxedo has never been seen again. The Haunting of Northwest Michigan.
The Manitou Passage, a narrow stretch of water between North and South Manitou Islands and the Leelanau Peninsula, has the infamous reputation as the graveyard of ships. Because the passage cuts miles from any up- or downbound voyage, and the islands offer some shelter from powerful westerly storms, taking the passage was worth the risk to many ships' captains, often to their greater sorrow. In the late fall of 1846, a nameless schooner sailing from Detroit to Chicago was about to enter the passage when a howling gale blew in. But this storm came straight from the north. The schooner was driven aground on a shoal just off North Manitou Island and pounded to pieces in a few hours. Everyone aboard was drowned, except one. A small boy clinging to a section of cabin floated ashore the next morning. He was rescued by local Indians, who then took him to Mackinac Island, where he was taken in and raised by a fisherman and his wife. In the years that followed, sailors on the lakes began to report an unnerving sight. As they passed the point where the wreck had occurred, they saw a woman standing on the deserted North Manitou shore and wailing, waving her arms as if begging for help. Several ships attempted to put a launch ashore to assist the woman, but the crews of those boats always returned empty-handed, wide-eyed and pale. The lady, they said, did not walk on the shore, but seemed to float back and forth. As they grew closer, her appearance became semi-transparent, and once they landed the boat and stepped ashore, she would vanish like a wisp of gray smoke. Stories of the Gray Lady would appear in multiple newspapers throughout the region in the ensuing years. People in Frankfurt and Leland would make a sport of training telescopes toward the island, hoping to catch a glimpse of her. One clever reporter linked the apparition to the sinking of the schooner in 1846, saying it could be the mother of the boy who survived that terrible night. She floated over the beach, the story said, crying out for her lost son. In 1896, work crews began construction on the North Manitou Lighthouse, which would become a critical aid to navigation through the treacherous passage. There was just one problem. The Gray Lady was terrifying the burly construction crews with her nightly appearances. They threatened to halt work unless something was done immediately. The editor of one of Frankfurt's newspapers took action. He traveled to Mackinac Island to find the sole survivor of that ill-fated schooner. Now over 50 years old, he had taken over the fishing business from his adopted father. After hearing the story, he agreed to return to the island, but insisted that his Methodist minister come along. The men traveled aboard a small steamer to North Manitou Island, where they gathered and knelt on a beach and prayed for the soul and eternal rest of the Gray Lady. A group of witnesses to the scene reported they saw a hazy form appear for a moment behind the sun, touch his hair, and then gradually evaporate. Construction resumed on the light, which was completed a year later. The Gray Lady never reappeared and has faded from most memories. Until tonight, and the haunting of Northwest Michigan. We hope you've enjoyed the 2023 edition of The Haunting of Northwest Michigan. Our thanks to Oak Heirlooms on Boone Road in Cadillac for sponsoring tonight's show. Visiting with Susan from Oak Heirlooms in Cadillac, we all know that cost of living is high, but Oak Heirlooms is working hard to keep life's nicer things within reach.
We want to be good to the people who have supported us for the last 35 years. I cannot begin to say how grateful I am for everyone.
Well, how about we offer a special discount to our radio listeners?
I really like that idea. When you stop in, ask us about the radio listener discount.
Oak Heirlooms on Boone Road in Cadillac, serving you for 35 years.